How many of y'all were surprised to find out that over half of the verses are commands in the book of James? It's a lot. And we say it tongue in cheek as Christians. We say, oh, it's the book of James, so it's gonna be a little challenging. It's gonna be hardcore. We say it, but when you actually look at how many commands they are, how blunt they are, how black and white they are, James was not playing around. And that's pretty much what I wanna start with, is just, James is really not for the faint of heart. If you are a casual believer, if you're a casual Christian, and you could read any book of the Bible and you're fine with it, but if the New Testament was a family, I want you to think of it this way. Paul would be the deep thinking theologian, kind of the center of the family, and then John would be like the loving grandfather, the one that always reminds you that you're loved and cherished and you were prayed for. And James is your older brother who tells you to quit whining and get back to work. People love Jesus. People love a lot of the teachings of Paul. Most people don't love James. When you actually look at what he teaches and then you actually try to put it into practice, it is uncomfortable for even seasoned Christians. And I can tell you this because if there was a seasoned Christian, I would consider Martin Luther to be one of them, and he called this book a book of straw. In other words, he said, I can't develop a sound theology out of this book. He felt like it sounded like works-based religion, and so he was not a huge fan of it. He wanted the deep spiritual thinking, and this one says, hey, deep spiritual stuff is great, but faith without works is dead. And so tonight we're just covering the first 18 verses. And basically James would say this. He would say, if your faith is real, it should change the way that you live. And that is something for all of us to think about, especially those that are newer believers. If you have been saved, if you've been redeemed, if you feel like you have done this the right way, you have the Spirit of the living God living in you, and you don't live any differently now than you did before then, something's off. And I'm not here to tell you that you're not saved. This is between you and the Lord, but I am here to tell you that you're missing something. Because serving God, loving God, it should change everything about you. It may not be like that. There's stories about that, but for most of us, it's a progression. But it should start happening when the Spirit of the living God lives in you, because what fellowship can light have with darkness? And one of them is going to win over time. So that's what makes James so powerful and convicting. So a lot of you know this, but who was James? Well, there are a few different Jameses in the New Testament, but this one is the half-brother of Jesus. I say half-brother because they had a different father. And you've probably heard this, but I'm not saying this to be funny. I actually want you to do this. Imagine growing up with Jesus as your older brother. And you look at him and he does not sin. What happens when there's a sibling rivalry? I wonder if there was ever a time where it's like, Mom, you always take his side. Well, he's always right. I don't know what you want me to do. I'll reference this a little bit later, but John 7:5 actually says, even his brothers didn't believe in him. Something changed in James at some point. Something after the resurrection. James became a key leader in the church, but he started as a skeptic. And that's one of your blanks if you're following along. He started as a skeptic, but he later became a leader in the early church. As a matter of fact, the early church may not have survived without somebody fulfilling the role that James did. He eventually became the head of the church in Jerusalem. That's a pretty key location. He was instrumental in one of the biggest church decisions that was ever made. And it was this. Y'all can rejoice in advance if you'd like. Do Gentiles have to become Jews before they can follow Jesus? The spoiler, no. So all of those requirements you do not have to do. Now there's a lot of wisdom in the Jewish culture, and there's a lot of wisdom in what the Lord handed down to them, just not the subject of tonight. If you want to refer to that decision being made, you can go to Acts chapter 15. It's not in your notes, but you might like that. James helped establish that salvation is for everyone, not just those that follow the law of Moses. And James wasn't just a leader in name, he lived it out. He was the face of this part of the movement. He was known as James the Just because of his deep commitment to righteousness. He very likely adhered to most of the Jewish, if not all of the Jewish commandments. But he was also nicknamed Camel Knees. He was known for a vibrant prayer life because he spent so much time on his knees in prayer that over time his knees actually wore into calluses. And so because of that, they called him Camel Knees, and somehow this was not an insult. But that does tell you something about the kind of man that James was. He was not just about hard truths, he was also about deep devotion. And that's important to know, because if you've ever known a believer who has told you you need to change this, you need to do this, you need to be this way, but you haven't felt the love of God in them, it's off-putting. It actually turns you away from the gospel. Isn't that crazy that people can actively turn you off from God, but they're made in his image, so they have some pull. So around AD 62 is when James was martyred for his death. This wasn't just a man preaching empty words. He lived and died for the message that he wrote in this letter. And here's why James matters. I just want you to understand this. It is so practical. I know it's challenging, but the reason it's challenging is because it's practical. If it addressed things you don't deal with in everyday life, it wouldn't feel challenging. But James is not worried about your feelings. So it tackles such questions as, how do you handle problems? Do you complain or do you let them grow you? How do you use your words? Do you build people up or do you tear them down? What do you do with money? He talks about that. Do you trust God with it or does it control you? And what do you prioritize? Do you fill your life with distractions or do you seek God first? So as we go through the study, I really do want to challenge you. Don't just listen to James, let his words change you, because his words were inspired by the Holy Spirit. So his words are God's words. With that in mind, let's go ahead and open up to James. I'm going to go ahead and read the verses as we go through them, but I want you to know that we're going to go through 6 important things in this session, okay? First and foremost, we're going to talk about this. Trials will come, but you can let them grow you. We're going to talk about how to ask for wisdom and trust God's answer. Man, that trust thing is all over this year. It won't let me go. Wealth fades, so you cannot build your life on it. Temptation comes from within, so don't blame God for it. And all of this is coming, so don't freak out and say, you talk so fast. God is unchanging, but we have to cling to his goodness. So we'll break it down verse by verse. The first thing in James 1:1 is a servant's identity. James does not begin his letter the way that you would. Let me rephrase that. James does not begin this letter the way that I would. He doesn't list his credentials or establish his authority. He doesn't introduce himself as James, brother of Jesus. He doesn't say he is James, the leader of the Jerusalem church. This is what he writes. This letter is from James, a slave of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ. I'm writing to the 12 tribes, Jewish believers scattered abroad. Greetings. The word he uses for slave is, I'm sure somebody knows this. What is it? Anybody? Doulos, right? So doulos, it always gets translated as slave, and we'll often hear this contrast. Well, he was the brother, but somehow he became okay calling himself the slave of Jesus and of God. It's not just slave. There's actually a whole different word for somebody who was captured and forced into slavery. This is more like bondservant slave. This is somebody who chose to remain, okay? So a bondservant was like, if you remember in the Old Testament, they have this where you could be a slave for X number of years, and if you chose to stay in the master's household, you wanted to be there, then what you could do is you could have him put a hole in your ear, using an awl on the doorpost of the home, and it's this whole thing, and then you know what? You'll stay there forever. That's the imagery that is used here. I chose this. I've welcomed it. I've walked into it, and I've now dedicated my life to it. If you look this up, there are people that will still live a doulos mindset. It's normally towards a cause, a vision, sometimes a company or a person, but it's not, with the whole nailing your ear to something kind of thing. But it is indicative of, I'm all in and sold out for this, and it was my choice. And it's important that you know that, okay? So James could have introduced himself as leader, brother, any of that, and he chose to call himself a bondservant. And so our identity isn't in what we achieve, it's in what we serve or who we serve. And this is very crucial to James. This devotion he had to the Lord did not come easily. James did not always believe in Jesus. I said we're gonna reference it again. In John 7:5, it says even his own brothers did not believe in him. And so humanize this for a moment. He grew up in the same house as Jesus. And even though Jesus didn't sin, they sat at a table together. I guarantee you he saw Jesus speak with his mouth open, right? They shared the same area where they would have used the restroom. All of the humanistic part of family values, he saw it. He saw the humanity. And do you remember when Jesus is actually talking to people and he said, prophets welcome everywhere, except in his own hometown and amongst his relatives. Because it's very hard once you know somebody to a certain level to allow them to exercise that authority over you. The family dynamics must have been wild. There goes Jesus again. What's he think he is, God? Wasn't until after the resurrection that James had his eyes open. In 1 Corinthians 15:7, that tells us that Jesus personally appeared to James after rising from the dead. And not just James, it says later by all the apostles. But scripture goes out of its way to say, then he was seen by James. And so that moment changed everything for him. Even as a leader, James still introduces himself not as a man of influence, but as a servant. And he didn't come just to believe in Jesus. He became one of the key leaders that really influenced a lot of other people as time went on. He chose to identify himself by who he serves and not what he has accomplished. So the personal reflection there that you can write there as we continue to talk about this is, how does his introduction challenge the way that we define ourselves? I mean, in our world, we tend to defend ourselves or define ourselves by what we do, what we achieve, how others perceive us. You know, hey, what's your name? What do you do? Normally, guys will say, what do you do? And normally, ladies will often talk about like, well, I'm married or I have kids. So we find our identity in our families and our jobs and our careers. And to be honest with you, many of us would kind of think it was silly if we met somebody and we're like, hey, what's your name? Are you new? And they said, hey, I'm Steve. I'm a servant of Jesus. Well, aren't we all here? Not really. Some people take it in name. Some people aren't ready to take it even in name, right? So he introduces himself that way, not because he's looking for attention, but because that's how he viewed himself. Oftentimes, the way that we introduce ourselves is the way that we view ourselves. But he wasn't just concerned with his own identity. He also says this, he's writing to the 12 tribes, Jewish believers scattered abroad. And this is important because it's also the concept of identity. So these Jewish believers are what? They're dispersed, they're scattered. They are without their homeland because as Christianity grew, they got chased out and it wasn't as safe, and so they started getting dispersed. And so here he is still holding down the fort in Jerusalem, but writing to these people that are feeling like they're losing their identity. And he says, not only is my identity important, but you need to know you are still God's people. And he still loves you and he still has purpose for you. Many Jews in that day had lost everything, their land, their businesses, their sense of belonging, and they had every reason to feel forgotten. And the first words James actually says to them carry a quiet but powerful message that you are God's. So they might have been scattered, but they were not abandoned. They might have been displaced, but they weren't disowned. And that is still true for us today. You may find yourself in a place where it feels like God is not present, but if you're a believer, you need to recognize that you are still God's own son. You are still God's own daughter. You are his people, because that's what James would want you to know. So James introduces himself as a servant. How does that compare to the way you typically introduce yourself to others? We'll talk about that in a moment. But I've left space there so you can fill in these questions as we go, and then you're not caught off guard at the end when we go over several of them. All right, so James chapter 1, verse 2 now, we're gonna talk about trials that grow us. Dear brothers and sisters, when troubles of any kind come your way, consider it an opportunity for great joy. For you know that when your faith is tested, your endurance has a chance to grow. So let it grow. For when your endurance is fully developed, you will be perfect and complete, needing nothing. Well, now that we're looking at it through the filter of being written to people who are scattered, they're away from their homeland, it makes sense why he would say, hey, look, you're gonna have to endure things. You are out of your comfort zone. All the stuff that we sing about and that we talk about, hey, we're in the world, but we're not of the world, and we say it like we're really proud, but we say it when we're in church surrounded by other believers. And then we get out there, and sometimes it's just a different story. So at first glance, this sounds completely backward. Who in their right mind would consider trials to be a good thing? Setbacks, pain, these are not normally our first reaction, but he uses a Greek word here. And the Greek word that he uses here is dokimion, and it literally translates as tested. It was commonly used in metal refining, and you've probably heard that many times. Gold and silver are put in intense heat. Impurities rise to the surface and burn something away, and that's what trials do to faith. Now, that being said, there are two different kinds of trials. There is test and there is temptation. One of them comes from God, one of them does not, but they are both trials. They're both difficult to endure. But when he says to let endurance grow, that phrase, especially the word let, implies that you have a choice when these trials come in. You can resist the trials, become bitter, fight against them, or you can allow them to strengthen your faith. But trials are going to come. And the good news is that faith doesn't grow in comfort, it grows in difficulty that you must endure. So when endurance is fully developed, James says, we become perfect and complete, needing nothing. Have you ever struggled with that verse? I've struggled with it because anytime it says perfect, I struggle with it. Then you'll be perfect. If you were to do all of this, you would be perfect. Be perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect. I thought I wasn't supposed to try to be perfect. It doesn't mean that trials will make you flawless. That's a goal that few of us admit to, but many of us pursue. It means they refine us into a mature and unwavering faith. So instead of asking ourselves, how do I get out of this? He says, ask, how is God growing me through this? Trials are meant to grow us, not destroy us. Endurance leads to being strong in the Spirit. Tests are always designed to help you advance. When you had a test, believe it or not, that teacher's job growing up was to make sure you could pass the test. I had a teacher in the second grade. I told you I couldn't resist it. Here's a quick story. I had a teacher in the second grade when I lived in New York. I was there for my first semester of the second grade. We moved here over Christmas break. And this teacher rigged the grades, it found out. We found out after moving to North Carolina, gave kids lower grades, and then eventually was raising them over the year to make it look like she was really good at her job. She was hoping to get a raise, but she got something else instead. A test is designed to prove that you have what it takes to go up a level to another grade, another challenge, right? But a temptation is designed to make you fail. And if you've ever been at a restaurant when the wait staff comes out and says, may I tempt you with dessert? Then you know this, okay? So your personal insight here. What am I currently trying to escape that needs the perspective shift of how is God growing me through this? It's an important question because as many times as I've read James, I keep finding, man, there's something else. All right, then you get to verse 5. If you need wisdom, ask our generous God, and he'll give it to you. He will not rebuke you for asking. But when you ask him, be sure that your faith is in God alone. Do not waver, for a person with divided loyalty is as unsettled as a wave of the sea that is blown and tossed by the wind. Such people should not expect to receive anything from the Lord. Their loyalty is divided between God and the world, and they're unstable in everything that they do. Could you imagine sitting down and receiving this counsel? You're like a wave on a windy day. You're unstable. You don't know what you're doing. Now, when it's said with love, that can change your life. And that's what James is trying to do. He's just been talking about these trials and how they shape our faith, and he knows something. Trials make us realize how much we don't know. Because when life falls apart and things aren't clear, and we're not sure what to do next, what do we need? Wisdom. He just said you're gonna have to endure through trials. And so when these trials come, how are you gonna endure? You're going to ask God for wisdom. And he says, don't worry, when you ask God for wisdom, he will not rebuke you. Now, rebuke is not a word that we use a lot outside of church. You should, because it would be hilarious, you know? When somebody comes up to you and they talk about, I don't know, they talk trash about your team, you say, I rebuke your football critique, or whatever it is. Unless they're trash talking the Cowboys. Fair game. Just kidding. I don't care about the Cowboys, actually. I just like to instigate. So when life falls apart, you need wisdom. But a lot of us, we withdraw. And so what he's saying is you can't do that. You need to ask God for wisdom. But there is a caveat. When you ask him, you have to ask him in the right mindset, in the right heart. It's one of the most reassuring promises in Scripture. God wants to give you wisdom. He actually wants to give you wisdom more than you want to receive wisdom. And you would say, well, then why is it so hard to get it sometimes? Well, that might be a personal discussion, but God's nature is generosity. Sometimes we feel like we're begging and scrambling to find God's wisdom and will for our lives, and he really does want us to know it. But remember, it says, when you ask him, be sure that your faith is in God alone. Do not waver, for a person with divided loyalty is as unsettled as a wave of the sea that is blown and tossed by the wind. Just last night, I was having a meeting, And the meeting was getting really close and then going over the time that I had to leave to go and pick up one of my kids. And I heard the Lord as clear as day. This is last night, it's less than 24 hours ago, saying, not yet. Every time I went to get up, he said, not yet. And when I felt like he released me, I got up. And I went to my wife and I said, I'm going to be late picking up one of our children. So didn't say anything about God because how do you fight back? That's not fair. And I said, so just want you to know that. And so she sends a message, hey, he's gonna be late. And when I get there, they're even later than I am. I'm not kidding. I was 10 minutes late and they were about 25 minutes late total. And I went, but you know what? In my head, it was, I'm pretty sure God is saying this. I wanna be obedient, but at the same time, well, if I'm wrong, here's what I'll say to Cassie. Here's how I'll try to work this out. That's double-minded. Double-minded is, God, give me wisdom. I feel like God is telling me this, but if that doesn't work, here's what I'll do. You might say, well, I'm not being unwise. I'm going to seek God. I want to do what God wants, but just in case, it's like Batman with a utility belt. I've got some sort of plan. Thank God for your plan. A lot of times you know what to do. It's fine. But if you find yourself in a trial where you need to ask God for wisdom, have you ever considered saying, God, I'm not interested in a plan B, I'm interested in you. So I'll wait until you give me the instruction for this trial, and then I'll just do it. It's hard, right? That takes faith. This is why James is not as revered as so many of the other authors in the Bible. That phrase, by the way, divided loyalty, here we go. It's dipsukos, which literally means two-souled. So we often hear a soul described as mind, will, and emotions. I don't know about you, I have trouble managing one set of those, okay? So this Holy Spirit comes to live within you. You have access to the mind of Christ, but you also have access to your mind. Have you ever felt that the Lord was pleased with you about something? There's nothing like it. It's so much better than when you're self-pleased with yourself about something. Have you ever been mad at yourself? Have you ever felt like the Lord stepped in? It's not condemning, but when he's displeased with something, you won't forget that feeling either. How do you manage all of these emotions and ideas and all of this of yourself and him? And we read scriptures like, more of you and less of me, and now it starts to make sense. Too many of us live two-souled, and that's what dipsukos is getting to. The sentence really describes somebody who's torn between trusting God and trusting themselves. And most of us won't say that when we're looking for counsel, when we're looking for a friend. Well, I'm trying to hear from God. That's what we'll say. Can you pray for me so I can hear God? We don't say, well, I'm trying to hear from God, but my voice is so loud. That's what James is getting at. Wisdom requires full obedience. James compares a double-minded person to a wave. A wave in a sea easily pushed in whatever direction that the wind blows. And so this is our reality check. We want guidance, but we also want control. And that's hard because once you take somebody else's advice, I'm firmly in my middle-aged period, but I remember what it's like to ask my mother for advice and to get good advice and then to have the feeling I don't want to do it because then she'll know that I did what she wanted. So I'm gonna do something else. Sometimes we just don't like it because we want our autonomy. We want God's direction, but only if it aligns with our plans. And here's the problem, on the off chance that it does align with your plans, how do you feel about that? I'm so wise. I had a great idea. Even God agrees with me on that. It's a little scary, isn't it? We ask for wisdom, but we hesitate when the wisdom that we receive requires faith. And James said that any other kind of faith just won't hold up. If you want wisdom from God, you have to be fully surrendered to what he reveals. You remember in Matthew 6:24, Jesus himself said, no one can serve two masters. So if you really want God's wisdom, you have to trust him and his own way. So here's your personal insight to fill in there. Where in my life am I asking for God's wisdom, but I'm still keeping my own plan as a backup? Just so you know, in the personal, this was the hardest part for me in writing this. I pride myself on having a backup plan. I always do. And you know what? Makes me look good a lot of times to the family or friends that I planned it in advance. And you know what that does? It just feeds the ego. That's all it does. So, all right, James 1, verse 9. Now he starts touching on wealth, but listen to this. He says, believers who are poor have something to boast about. I know that's the middle of a sentence. I'm just gonna stop though. I've never heard somebody boast about it. Seriously, I mean, that sounds funny, but have you? I've never heard somebody boast about it. I've heard somebody say that they were in that place and then say, but praise God. But we're gonna talk about this. So believers who are poor have something to boast about, for God has honored them. And some of us are like, honor me a little less. Those who are rich should boast that God has humbled them. They will fade away like a little flower in the field. The hot sun rises and the grass withers, and the little flower droops and falls, and its beauty fades away. In the same way, the rich will fade away with all of their achievements. So James shifts gears here, but I don't want you to feel like he's fully on a different track. He's still talking about perspective during trials. This is all connected. And a lot of times in sermons, we pick 1, 2, 3 verses because it lines up with the point, and that's fine. But just read all of this in context. He's still talking about your perspective in a trial. After discussing how to endure hardship with wisdom, he challenges us on the way that we measure success and security. And I will say this again, this is not a message on personal finances. It's a message on how you decide you are either safe or a success. And it is not a secret that wealth and status absolutely shape how we view ourselves and other people. And it was not different in the ancient world. Just like today, riches were seen as a sign of God's blessing. I have also personally never heard somebody say, man, I went to the mailbox and I had a check for $1 million, which I could just end it there. I've never heard that. But I got a check for $1 million and I was just really humbled because God, you know I didn't want this. That's what he's saying though. We look at this like riches are always a sign of God's blessing and poverty is always seen as a sign of his disapproval or his judgment. Read the book of Job. Loss is always looked at like it's a curse. And many Jewish believers, especially those that were forced from their homes due to persecution, those who had lost everything, people who were now in poverty, it would be easy for them to feel like failures or like God had abandoned them. And James could not let that stand. So he flipped their thinking upside down and said the poor should boast, not in their lack, not boast because they're poor, but they should boast because of their exalted status before God. Hey, you know what? I'm completely dependent on God. You know what'll make you close to him? Dependency. But the rich should recognize that even their success is temporary and that God is using humility to shape them. We've probably all heard this at some point. Can't take it with you when you go. And we're like, I know that, but I'm gonna take it with me wherever I go right now. And you can, because I don't even need my wallet anymore. I can just tap my phone against a piece of plastic and buy a burrito. It's too easy to do it now. So this radical statement that James says, he is saying this, hey, if you're in poverty, please understand that you are honored in God's kingdom. And he's telling the rich that your wealth is fleeting, you cannot trust in it. And he uses something that they would have all been familiar with. He says, the hot sun rises and the grass withers, the little flower droops and falls, and its beauty fades away. This was probably the most vivid imagery that he could have used for people that were growing up in the Middle East. Still to this day, but especially then, you could see a flower in the morning, something that's vibrant and green, and by the end of the day, drooping, withering. Over the course of one day, less than a 24-hour cycle, you could see a difference. And James is making a very painfully honest observation. It's good to earn, it's good to be diligent, but wealth won't last, and success doesn't last, and beauty doesn't last. Everything that we build in this life will fade. I don't say it to be morbid, it's just the way that it is. The rich man might be comfortable now, but the achievements don't follow into eternity, but neither does the poverty. So James is challenging every reader of this letter to shift their focus. The poor believer's already rich. They're rich in faith, they're rich in God's promises, they are rich in an inheritance that will never fade, and it's the same inheritance that's promised to the wealthy on this earth. And the financially rich believer must also remember that it's a temporary tool, not a permanent security. And for those who are gifted with wealth, it makes you wonder if you've been given it in this life and you won't have it later, what is the purpose of it? Now, there's also things, leave a good inheritance to your family. I'm not telling you what to do with it, but you need to think on it. So your personal insight here is this. What do I honestly view as the measure of whether or not I'm successful in life? Can't answer it for you. But I can go to verse 13. So after talking about this, he says, God blesses those who patiently endure testing and temptation. Now we're back to this. Afterward, they'll receive the crown of life that God has promised to those who love him. And remember, when you're being tempted, do not say, God is tempting me. God is never tempted to do wrong, and he never tempts anyone else. Temptation comes from our own desires, which entice us and drag us away. These desires give birth to sinful actions, and when sin is allowed to grow, it gives birth to death. So here, James has already established that trials grow us. We talked about that. And then he makes a new distinction after talking about wealth, indecision, the need for wisdom. He teaches that not every hardship comes from God. Again, you could see the book of Job for further reference on that. But like we were talking about, there's a difference between a test that strengthens your faith and a temptation that leads to sin. They're both challenges, but their origins and outcomes are completely different. Both are trials, one designed to make you succeed, one designed to make you fail. I've been asked from time to time, I can't tell if this is a test from the Lord or if it's a temptation from the enemy. What do I do? It might sound a little trite to you, but normally my answer is something along the lines of, pass the trial. I don't know if it's a temptation or if it's a test from the Lord, but do the right thing. Well, I just don't know who sent it to me. Sounds tough. Do well on whatever it is. Now, obviously, depending on what it is, there can be more of a discussion, but sometimes we'll just bog ourselves down with overthinking. James begins with a promise. He says, God blesses those who patiently endure testing and temptation. And a lot of us, the second that trials hit, the second that we feel tempted, we don't have the ability to hold out. Something I've learned now that I'm exploring the world of OCD is there's a term that they use called urge surfing. Has anybody heard of this? I never thought I'd be a surfer, but here I am. An urge surfing moment means when you get the urge to do something, you see how long you can ride the wave. If you can last on that wave until it crashes to shore and you get there safely. So with OCD, it stands for obsessive compulsive. When you have an obsession, when there's something that lands in your mind, the compulsion is what you need to do to make that go away. And the therapy option is, but what if you don't do that? What if you ride it out until it goes away? So follow me on this. You feel tempted to lie. You feel tempted to think about something you shouldn't. You feel tempted to take something. You feel tempted to touch something, eat something, whatever that you're not supposed to. This says God blesses those who patiently endure testing and temptation. Well, God's just testing me. I wish he'd hurry up on this. Don't you want the blessing? I mean, I want to pass it, but I also want the blessing. So he says you're going to have to endure. I don't have a formula to tell you how to make the test happen faster. I don't have 3 easy steps to tell you how to get out of temptation, but I can tell you that there's a blessing when you endure. And the word endure, I don't normally use so much Greek when I'm preaching, but I'm not preaching tonight. The word endure here comes from the Greek word hupomeno. I wrote it down there for you. Hupomeno, which means to stand firm, remain under pressure, not give up, not buckle. It's the idea of a person who refuses to quit. James says that those who endure receive a crown of life. And it's not a royal crown, obviously. The word there is Stephanos, and it refers to a victor's wreath, the prize that's given to an athlete who's finished a race and won a competition. He's basically saying the race is hard, but you will get rewarded. And in Revelation 2:10, just so you know, we see Jesus himself say, be faithful until death, and I will give you the crown of life. How can a woman be faithful until death? endurance. So James then shifts to a different kind of struggle, which is temptation. He says, remember when you're being tempted, do not say that God is tempting me. Now, I used to think this is not something Christians struggle with. I was wrong. I know that we're in an era where we want to feel heard or seen or understood, and James shuts that down as an excuse before it even starts. It would be easy to assume that if trials come from God, then maybe temptations do. Or if tests come from God, maybe temptations do. And James makes it clear, God tests us to strengthen our faith, and he doesn't tempt us. Temptation is never from God. So where does it come from? I'm glad you asked. There's a cycle. The cycle of sin follows this pattern. It starts with desire. And even if we're not willing to do it in public or in private, we all know the evil desires within us. There's not one person in this sanctuary, on this live stream, doing this study at this pulpit, who doesn't have thoughts that they have to then take and submit them to the cross. It comes from within. Now, a lot of people get stuck in a shame cycle there because once these thoughts and these desires well up, we think, what is wrong with me? Why would I even think that? You're asking the wrong question. It's not about you. There is a sin nature in you, but since you can't fix it, maybe you shouldn't fixate on you. Oh, I said that right, and I wasn't even trying to say it like that. It starts inside of you because you want something. It might be comfort, control, pleasure, approval, power, could be something else. And then there's enticement. There's a Greek word there. The Greek word there is exelko, and it means to bait or trap. Do not make a mistake about this. It's a hunting term. As soon as you desire something, there's a trap laid. Well, how does the enemy know? Come on. They don't have anything else to do except attack those made in the image of the Lord. And so sin always looks attractive before it traps you. The picture that's probably good here, I grew up watching a lot of Looney Tunes, so the big metal trap that's on the ground with whatever's there in the middle, the cupcake, the carrot, the whatever, and you step on it and that trap closes on you, and that's what happens. You could say, well, I would have never gone in there if I wasn't tempted to get what was in there. Well, you desired it. That's what drove you there. But still, we have not talked about anything that was sin. The trap being laid is a temptation. It is not a sin to be tempted. And some of you probably need to hear that. Jesus was tempted in the wilderness. You remember that. So being tempted is not a sin. Wanting to cave to temptation is not in and of itself a sin unless you decide to follow it through, because there is flesh within us. Temptations are opportunities. They're only opportunities, and you can choose to sin against the Lord or to glorify him by overcoming. Now, the action that happens in step 3, we act on it, we give it a foothold. That's when we step in the trap and it closes. And the last one is death. Sin always leads to destruction. It doesn't all happen at once, but it always catches up. Because every time you step into sin, you might feel like you escaped consequences for that time, and you might have. But sin also slowly chips away at your character. It chips away at your soul, your mind, your will, your emotions, and over time, you'll make worse and worse decisions because you've made smaller and smaller compromises that all of a sudden you realize weren't so small anymore. So it's not just an immediate trap, it's something that is meant to trap you over time. But temptation will always follow that pattern to a T. And James warns you that sin doesn't just affect your behavior, it affects your soul. Theologian John Owen said, he died in the 1600s, so when I say this, it might sound like a rap lyric, it's not. But he died in the 1600s. He said, be killing sin, or sin will be killing you. It's true. Be killing sin, or sin will be killing you. I'm sure it sounded differently in 1684. But that's the heart of James's warning. If you don't recognize sin early, if you don't cut it off before it grows, it will consume you. And James is showing us that tests strengthen us and temptations deceive us. So, where in my life am I tolerating a temptation? And the reason I say that is because there's a desire that's welled up, there's enticement happening, maybe you haven't acted on it, maybe you haven't put your foot in that trap yet. But if you're looking to get the most out of this book, my question to you is, where in my life am I tolerating a temptation that I assume won't consume me. And then we're going to read the last couple verses, 16 through 18, on the goodness of God. And this is what James goes on to say. He says, "Don't be misled, my dear brothers and sisters. Whatever is good and perfect comes down to us from God our Father, who created all the lights in the heavens. He never changes or casts a shifting shadow. He chose to give birth to us by giving us his true word, and we, out of all creation, became his prized possession." Now, he says this right after saying no temptation comes from God. So he's saying, look, you've got tests, you've got temptations, you've got all these trials. Some of the tests have come from God, but God will never tempt you. As a matter of fact, he says, don't be misled about this. All the good stuff comes from him. Well, how can he be responsible for all the good stuff? It's because he's so good. James has spent several verses warning us about the deceptive nature of temptation. He's warned us that it starts with desire. He's told us it's going to lure us in, and ultimately that it leads to death. And now he shifts his focus, because when we're struggling and when life is difficult and when temptation is at our doorstep, we begin to question something bigger. Is God really good? And we don't like to admit it, but we find things that don't feel, quote unquote, fair in life. And it becomes really hard to reconcile in our mind. And maybe out of a religious devotion, some of us are unwilling to say the words out loud, God isn't good to me right now, but we feel it. And God knows that we feel it, and God knows when we think it. And that's why James starts with a warning, and he says, don't be misled. So what I have learned through the book of James is that every time I start to question if God is fair, or if God is actually doing something that's good or right, you know what I've realized about myself? I got some sin in here. I'm being misled somewhere. Because if there's one person I can count on my entire life, it is the Lord. So it's easy to think that temptation is something that only comes in obvious forms, like a wrong decision, a sinful desire, or a moment of weakness. But temptation is more than that. And it's something that I honestly never even thought of as a temptation until I wrote this study. One of the greatest temptations that we face in hardship is to doubt the goodness of God. If you succumb to the temptation of doubting God's goodness, what will you succumb to next? Because once you don't think he's good, you won't ask him for wisdom. Once you think he's not fair, you won't submit things before him. And when life is hard, we wrestle with questions like, why would God let this happen? I'm writing questions I've asked myself, just so you know. If he loves me, why am I struggling? It's a very selfish question. Why does he seem so far away? How would James respond to these thoughts? He says, God hasn't changed. He's still the giver of every good and perfect thing. The problem isn't that God has shifted, it's our own perspective has. And he reinforces this by saying he never changes or casts a shifting shadow. I used to hear that as just religious speak. Well, a shifting shadow, I don't know if you can see it from where you're sitting or if you can see it on the video, but there's a shadow right here because the light is shining on me in this direction. If I walk around to the other side of the light, the shadow is going to end up shifting. And James is saying, God is not moving. So if all of a sudden it feels like you're in a shadow when you were in his light, something moved and it wasn't him. If something's truly good, it comes from him. And if it hasn't changed, we need to look at the reason for it. When James takes this even further after this, he says, not only is God good and unchanging, he's the one who gives us life itself. Isn't it interesting in the same verses, he talks about shifting shadows and the Father of lights. And he says, he chose to give birth to us by giving us his true word, and we out of all creation became his prized possessions. James reminds his readers that God's goodness isn't just seen in creation, it is seen in salvation because he gave birth to us. And this is something that is so beautiful in this first chapter of James. Listen, temptation grows and gives birth to sin. Sin grows and gives birth to death. And God gives birth to life. And he does this contrast and he compares it there on purpose. Because he says, listen, your temptation is gonna grow and it's just gonna give you sin. But the more that you let sin grow, it's just gonna give birth to death. But there is someone who gives birth to life. And James is pointing them back to the gospel, back to the good news. God brought us into spiritual life, not because we earned it, not because we deserved it, but because he chose to. I love new life. I love baby dedications. But again, I've never gone to visit a brand new baby and had them say, man, that baby worked hard. They really earned their birth. We were thinking about making them stay another couple months until they were, ready to behave. No. The baby's just growing. They don't know what's happening. They're probably traumatized. It's a good thing God doesn't let us remember that part of our life. Birth is just a gift. And so is your spiritual rebirth. James really wanted these readers to remember that they're God's chosen people, that God didn't need them, God didn't have to have them, but that he chose them. He wanted them to remember that they were God's people, and we need to remember it too. God is not tolerating you. Whether you treasure yourself or not, God treasures you. And I know this because he said we, out of all creation, became his prized possession. The prized possession reference there, by the way, that is a direct reference to the Old Testament language where God calls Israel his treasured people in scriptures like Exodus 19:5 or Deuteronomy 7:6. James is taking that same imagery and he's applying it to these scattered, struggling, impoverished believers. And he is saying, I don't know your circumstance, but listen, you are still his, you're still chosen, you are still his first fruits, the most valued part of the harvest. So I'm not trying to give you theological encouragement today, I'm trying to give you a reality check. That if God is truly good, if he never changes, if he doesn't lie, if he's given us life and he calls us his own, why do we doubt him when things get hard? So don't fall for the lie that God is anything less than good, because the moment that we start doubting his goodness, you will look for fulfillment somewhere else every single time. You might say, well, I'm still holding on to God. Yeah, with this arm, but now we're back to the double-minded thing. Real faith forces itself over into a singular focus. So here's the real question. Which voices are you listening to? And if we're constantly being told two different messages, one saying God's holding out on you, chase what you want, and one that says God is good, trust him, which decision will we make? So the personal reflection here is, where in my life am I questioning God's goodness instead of trusting him? What we're gonna do now is we're gonna take a few minutes and here in person, we're gonna have a group discussion on this. If you are watching on the live stream, I hope you're watching it with other people. If not, talk to yourself. It'll be fun.